Okay, everyone, we are now prepared to go a little bit deeper in settler colonialism. And if you've not gotten this information before, settler colonialism is, it's not a new concept in terms of thinking about settlers and its relationship to colonization, but it really wasn't until the 90s and certainly the 2000s that a concept began to emerge to differentiate what's happening in certain contexts around the globe with indigenous peoples in democratic nation states as opposed to other forms of colonization. So what I want to do is just take you through some notes and try to make a case and an argument for what I'm talking about in terms of settler colonialism and how it relates to race and racism, specifically in connection to indigenous groups. So settler colonialism first finds its major articulation in the research with an essay by an anthropologist who is Australian, I think, Patrick Wolf. Patrick Wolf is an anthropologist by training, and he's not native, but he had enough experience as an anthropologist and sort of thinking about what is decisively different in the indigenous experience with peoples of, say, nation states like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and of course the United States. So what Wolf does in the 1990s, and certainly by the 2000s, we have a much more robust sort of way of conceptualizing settler colonialism. By the way, the abbreviation SC is what I'll be referring to from this point onward. So SC begins to shift the focus of colonialism from traditional concepts. Recall colonialism, what I call in my own work, good old-fashioned colonialism, which has this internal and external component to it, is conceptualized differently, describing the colonizing experiences of Native peoples in the US, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia a little bit differently. In fact, vastly different, as we'll see. So what distinguishes SC from colonialism is basically this, that SC societies, what we would call a settler colonial structure, I'll eventually call that, or a settler colonialism in general, is premised on this basic claim, and this is Wolf's claim, elimination of native societies. So settlers and their descendants, right? So going back to the early forms of settlement in these various contexts, and their descendants, they come to the New World not only to stay on the New World, lands and territories, but to replace the indigenous populations entirely. And here's one of Wolf's famous quotes. He says, "Invasion is a structure, not an event." Okay, invasion is a structure, not an event. So the old forms of colonialism have the sense that it's a historical moment in which the dominant group comes in and begins to establish itself, its institutions, laws, its discourses, etc. And that you can point to certain moments in that history and call it colonialism. SC says that event is not the accurate term. What is the accurate term is structure. So I want you to think about structure. And again, we're not quite at race yet, but to sort of think about, what structure, just hold that in your mind. And what this means is that colonialism is a settler, SC, is that the aim of SC is, because of the structure, is an elimination of indigenous peoples, their lands, and it's always about lands, okay? To remove, to displace, I'll use this word quite a bit, erasure or to erase, and to eliminate the native society, native peoples. And at the heart of SC, Wolf states, is, and this term will become very important for us, is a genocidal tendency. Now, genocide is a term that comes much later in the political discourse. It's not until the 50s where we start to see this term, especially after World War II, and it begins to take a much more thicker tone, that it's not just invasion, but we're talking genocide of a people. But by the time we get to this scholarship in the settler colonial literature, we see that genocide is now tied to structural, to the structure of a particular society. Now, and this is problematic because in the old forms of genocide, or the current or the former forms, that genocide kind of still has that, momentary, you can point to it, etc. But for SC, genocide isn't just this kind of thing that we might call frontier homicide, right? Or military conquest, as if they're events. But genocide is woven into the structure, and it takes on multiple forms, right? Now, what's important here in terms of race is that a good part of the genocidal structure that we begin to analyze in settler colonial literature is that it's tied to notions of race, how Native peoples have been raised, what their racial characterizations become, stereotypes, everything from, the Pocahontas stereotype, Native women, etc., to how Native peoples are portrayed in the media and film and that kind of stuff. So I'm focusing primarily on the United States context. Okay, so SC has that sort of different structure. It's about elimination. It's about erasure of indigenous peoples from their lands and territories. So settler colonialism operates through what we would call both internal and external modes simultaneously. There was no spatial separation between what we would call the mother country, say Britain or France, and the colony. The settler structure operates through both internal and external forms. It was internal by the fact that the US, and we're talking US now, erected and established reservations to control Native peoples. Now, this is a long story to talk about reservations, but they begin with removal and displacement. Various laws get passed in US history that going back to the early 1800s, where Native peoples, and we're talking, a lot of people talk about the Cherokee, for example, but there are dozens of forced removals that take place, if not more than that. So basically across the country, and some of these removals are vast, some of them are just not quite as vast, but they're still removals nonetheless. It's almost as if most groups that are resistant to quote unquote progress of the U.S., their removal is inevitable in many ways because of these laws and decisions that get passed, etc. But it was also external, SC was, in the sense that the U.S. extracted natural resources from native lands for the purpose of profit. And that is still happening today. So if you watch The Seventh Generation, one of the arguments that I'm going to make here is that Native peoples in the structure of settler colonialism, being raised, being othered, right, are caught up in this external element of SC where the purpose of displacement and removal, elimination in some cases, but general erasure, is for the natural extraction of resources. And that is still happening today. Standing Rock is the latest iteration of this, and still happening right now. The displacement of tribal groups from their indigenous lands is another way in which the structure of SC maintains itself, continues. Okay, so we have both internal and external forms being a part of SC. So another element in which SC differs from other forms of colonialism is another famous quote that Wolfe makes: settlers come with the intention of making a new home on the land, a homemaking that insists on settler sovereignty over all things in their new domain. So right away with the settler colonial conception, land is essential. settlers make indigenous lands their new home and source of capital. And what Wolff and others argue is that this is a violence, a structural violence, because it has a profound impact on indigenous relationships to land, disrupting their ways of being, ways of knowing, cosmological significance, a spirituality, their very sense of identity, their very sense of culture among a people. And this is why Wolff describes SC as a structure and not an event. Land is remade into property, and the human relations are restricted to the relations of an owner to his property. So with the idea of structure, not an event, that Wolff tells us that land then is remade into property, and human relations are restricted to the relationships of an owner to his property. Okay? So for settlers to make the place their new home, they must, and here's where the racism, the institutional racism, really takes hold, right? That the settler colonial structure must destroy and disappear the indigenous peoples who live there. Okay, now this destruction, again, isn't just a frontier homicide or a genocide in the classic sense, but destruction, erasure, elimination, it takes on multiple forms. Okay? And so the logic behind SC then turns into something like this, and you may have heard of concepts like manifest destiny. But this notion, and this shows up in the structure in many ways, right? The way that films get made in the 40s and 50s, the Western, right, has this sort of notion to it that indigenous peoples, native peoples of the lands become barriers to progress, right? They're in the way of settlement. These are people who are backward and uncivilized, right? This is the racial component that starts to come in. Unable or incapable of making the land work properly for profit and gain. And so what we have right away in this SC structure is the juxtaposition, the binary between white and native. And another way of sort of saying it is the relationship between colonizer and colonized. All of these have obviously difficulties, right? Classifying people very neatly into binaries, but this is how SC thinks. SC begins to make the distinctions, right? Who are we as white folk? Who are we as the ones who are the rightful beneficiaries of manifest destiny? Well, we're not them. We're not the uncivilized. We are the civilized ones. We're the ones who know how to work the land as property, right, for gain, etc. So over time and through law and policy, the settler society, and I would just jump right up to today, claims land under settler regimes and legal systems. Okay. Land now as property and resources means that indigenous peoples have to be erased. And as one indigenous scholar puts it, indigenous peoples must be made into ghosts. Okay. A settler society that then begins to form. It involves the subjugation and forced labor of chattel slavery, for example. It needs other bodies to make the land work for it. Bodies of a particular other race, right? Africans become slaves, chattel slavery, and they too then become property. Settlers see themselves as holding dominion over the lands, right? As a more developed and deserving human being. And so the idea that starts to become more evolved in the structure of the settler colonial discourse, something like what is wild, untamed, both lands and peoples, these become made for the settler's benefit, right? The settler's identity as settler is to make the land productive. Okay, so the claim here is that the United States, is a settler society, a nation state that gets formed not just based on racial distinctions, but underlying that. This is the argument that Alan's not making and others who talk about race in terms of indigenous experience. Either sidestep or they're not even aware that this is something to think about, is that the very notions of race that get constructed, underlying that is this motivation that the settler society is the rightful way to be the occupiers of places and locations and over people. Okay, and so race becomes one of the tools, one of the ways in which you can make these binary distinctions between those who have rightful place in the order and those who don't. Okay, so let me just offer a couple of details, just so we summarize this in a little bit of. I just want to give you a couple of key points that that you'll have. So four main components that I want to give you for settler colonialism. So if you were to define what settler colonialism is, this is how you might go about it. That settler colonialism is premised on this idea of the elimination of the native. You want to get that right away. That the entire structure of SC is premised on this notion that these peoples who are blocking progress need to be erased. And so the notion of race emerges, that whiteness or nativeness or indigeneity is a binary opposition with whiteness on top and indigeneity on the bottom. That's the hierarchy that is established in the structure. But it's not sufficient just to classify. The aim of SC is to eliminate that presence, that native presence. The second point, settlers come to stay. You want to drive that point home. Unlike other forms of colonialism, the settler makes the land its new home, becomes the sovereign people. In some cases, becomes the original people who were destined to be there, the ones who truly belong, right? The ones destined to make the land what it should be. So policies, laws, and strategies and discourses become normalized in the settler colonial structure. One I've already said before, that SC is a structure, not an event. So when we talk about SC, we don't say something like, colonization is something of the past, or we have to look at the past as events in time where Native peoples were relocated, etc. Those are important things, but the arc of it is that the structure encompasses not just past but also present, and it's a pervasive. The SC structure it's a pervasive presence, in many ways extremely difficult to see. Okay? And they show up in various institutions: religious, educational, economic, cultural, and political. Okay. Lastly, just the last point, just to drive home, is that SC is inherently genocidal. Now, again, it's not about, as Patrick Wolf, he has a sort of dramatic way of saying it, the liquidation of the native. It's not just about that. It's not just about military conquest, right? But it can also be about legal extermination, right? That we just eliminate you legally from the structure. Okay, genocide, the genocidal tendency inherent in SC structure is assimilation, assimilating Native peoples into the structure, right? Making them not Native, or forcing them to take up white Christian notions of what it means to be civilized, or what it means to even be a human being. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of the native study scholarship, the notion of SC is a anthropological concept, and not all Native scholars are anthropologists, of course, and they do their own sort of theorizing about what this colonizing relationship is. And we're going to find some disagreement between Native scholars and anthropologists who are using SC language or even Native peoples themselves in the scholarship using SC. So for example, there's a scholar, Luana Ross, prefers the notion of colonialism, right? Don't use settler colonialism, use good old-fashioned colonialism, describe what she calls the logic of incarceration. For Ross, colonization has meant that indigenous peoples have been confined to forts, boarding schools, orphanages, jails, and prisons, and on reservations, right? So Ross says today Native peoples are not free, and settler colonialism sort of gives a kind of space where you can kind of, as a Native person, wander in the structure and not feel or be realize that you were a part of this colonizing relationship. And for Ross, colonization is the word that we would still use, and it's a very explicit kind of relationship that we want to get. I mean, that's just one example, you know, there are lots more to focus on with that. And if you have any questions about how the Native Studies Scholarship sees this notion of settler colonialism, I'm happy to provide more resources. But hopefully you got a better sense of what SC is, and thinking about the racialized experiences of indigenous peoples being certainly connected to the overall process of race formation in the United States, but that it's a different process. And what's interesting, I'll leave you with this last point, is that when you are talking about indigenous or Native identity, from the perspective of the dominant group, certainly Native peoples have been brought into the discourse of race formation. If you're looking at census data going back to the earlier years of the census collection, certainly if you read various case law or Supreme Court decisions or just policies or executive orders, there's no question that Native peoples are being raced, being brought into the race concept. And but the SC structure analysis that I'm giving offers you a way of seeing how that racial formation is different from other racial groups. It's rooted in land dispossession, erasure, that kind of thing. A violence, we'll call it a structural violence. Anyway, Native groups themselves don't necessarily see themselves as race. Indigeneity becomes another category entirely, and it's more political as opposed to race. All right, everyone, good luck.